My brother called me a homeless bum when I lost my apartment. Now he's demanding I give him my hard-earned house and return to live in the camper. Growing up with my younger brother, it's obvious that he's favorite. We're 3 years apart in age, but he developed a superiority complex because I was badly punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way back then. My brother got physically abusive towards me on several occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had, and my parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. The start of 2020 was not kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo. I own a truck simply because I've always loved trucks, so I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck to live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I lived out of it far longer than I ever thought. I originally hoped to live out of the camper at my parents' house where my brother and his family still reside, but when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they told me they had a full house and didn't want me there. Plus, we hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they'd only agree to let me park my camper there if I paid them basically what it'd cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park my camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as possible until I could find a new job. I may as well be living in an apartment at that rent price they requested. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement, and sister-in-law thought it was hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her in pointing out and mocking me while calling me a homeless bum. Finding a stable place to park was pretty difficult. I looked around to find a job similar to my old one. It took months of living the nomadic camper life. At that time, I had to deal with a lot. Everything from beggars and substance addicts to people demanding. I leave because my camper was an eyesore. To have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse, an old employee parking space as no one else seemed to bother using them because they were so far in the back that the area was borderline forgotten. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned some new skills from other employees hands-on. Eventually, midway into this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than I had in my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I'd gotten from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work, and just 2 miles away, I found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck behind the house to take the camper off and set it up in the backyard, so I put it there as a little building just in case I want to use it again. When I was fully settled in the house, I was dumb enough to brag about it on my Facebook. My family saw the post, and that's where this starts. After a few weeks, my parents, brother, and his family visited completely unannounced to tour my home. I didn't even give them my address, so how they found out where I live, I still don't know. Once I opened the door, they practically all shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists. Then, they just started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and sister-in-law had this creepy smirk that she was repeatedly flashing me, and it was only later that I figured out why. My parents constantly talked about how I've got so much extra space now, and it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. My brother said there was more space here than our parents' house, and my house was also closer to his job. Eventually, my brother asked me to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out onto the front porch. That's what finally made me realize they'd planned something. My brother, let's call him Dan, said the house was too much for me alone, and I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with kid number 4, and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already had the camper, so I could live outside while they lived in the main house. And I'd like to point out that Dan never once spoke of offering rent. Mind you, he's got a good job. He also started talking about how there would be changes and even curfews, and that I couldn't just walk in at any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I'd think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say. There was no way in hell I'd rent my house or parts of my house to him, so I picked up my phone and set it to start recording. Then I just held on to it. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I'd done this and just sat there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. Then went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal and trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. I finally showed my backbone and said hell no, and I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I'd rarely ever raised my voice to him on that level because I was punished by our parents whenever I did, but this was my house, not theirs. My spine can be as shiny as it wants here. I stood up and told him my house was not up for grabs, and acting like I'll let him move in just because they want it won't make it happen. I bought my house for me, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and have to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me and said that I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed back in his face and said that was total bull's tea because I worked hard to be able to buy my house. Of course, I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids and don't need all the space, so I may as well give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything, and he never even offered to pay me rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live there. Then Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents said I was going to do this, and that I would. I yelled as if their word was law or something, and told Dan that they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then right on cue, my parents and sister-in-law barged back in through the front door and surrounded me to try and force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting. But to sum it up, I heard the line, "Just do it for Dan," way more times than I can remember. In the fight, I told them all they don't have a say in my life or my house, and to get out before I called the cops. Sister-in-law screamed the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again, and I couldn't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her. She just assumed she could take and take from me like I would just allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up beach who never had any respect for me, so I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I have no sympathy for her. She won't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She got in one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back, kicking and screaming. She kept demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded pretty much everything, so I held it up and said I would call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving. Then my mother said I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I won't be, and not to come back. Then I told sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything, and if she tried anything, I'd press charges for assault. She screamed at me, and then stormed out loudly, crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said, I better do this for Dan and sister-in-law. I responded by telling her I won't be,